I was supposed to be in Dallas that weekend, catching up with an old friend I hadn't seen in years. We'd planned to sit on his porch, talk about the old construction jobs we used to take in the 80s, and maybe complain a little about our knees. But life, as I've learned, doesn't always follow your itinerary. The storm hit early that morning, grounding flights across Texas. When the loudspeaker finally announced that mine was canceled, I just sighed. There wasn't any anger left in me for things like that. At my age, you learn to take what comes and move on. So I called a cab and headed back home. I remember watching the rain streak across the window as the driver took the long way through Maple Street. That's when something caught my eye, a big, white moving truck sitting in my driveway. The back door was hanging open and its engine was still running. That didn't make sense. I hadn't called any movers. I wasn't planning to move anywhere, not since Laura passed. Every part of that house was still hers. The scent of her soap on the towels, her favorite mug by the kitchen sink. I hadn't touched a thing. My gut tightened. After decades in construction, you learn to read signs. Warm engine, open door, no movers in sight, something was wrong. I handed the driver a 20 and told him to drop me off right there. As he pulled away, I stood under the gray Texas sky, the smell of wet asphalt filling the air. My work boots sank slightly into the gravel. I could hear the hum of that truck's engine fading into silence. Then I heard another sound, a sharp scrape of metal against metal coming from the side of the house. I followed the noise, stepping carefully along the narrow path beside Laura's azalea bushes. The closer I got, the louder it became, steady, deliberate, rhythmic. My heart thudded against my ribs. When I turned the corner and saw who was kneeling at my basement door, my entire body went cold. It wasn't a stranger. It was my son Ethan and his wife Vanessa. Each held a crowbar, working furiously at the lock I'd changed just last week. For a second I couldn't speak. My mind couldn't reconcile what my eyes were seeing. My son, the same boy I'd taught to swing a hammer and fix a cabinet, was breaking into my home like a thief. Dad, Ethan froze his face, turning pale. "Weren't you supposed to be in Dallas?" I didn't answer. I just looked at the tools in their hands, the sweat on their faces, the open truck behind them. The pieces started fitting together in ways I didn't want them to. Laura always said, "The truth comes quietly." Henry, you just have to be brave enough to listen. That day, standing under the drizzle with the smell of diesel and betrayal in the air, I listened and I finally heard it. I stood there in disbelief, the air thick with tension. My eyes drifted from their guilty faces to the truck sitting in my driveway. Its open back looked like a gaping mouth ready to swallow everything that ever mattered to me. Something in me said I needed to look to see for myself what they'd been doing. I walked toward it slowly, my boots crunching the gravel. Ethan called after me, his voice shaky, but I didn't turn around. Vanessa whispered something under her breath, maybe trying to come up with another excuse. I climbed onto the truck's platform and pulled back the heavy moving blankets. What I saw inside felt like a punch to the chest. There it was, Laura's oak dining table, the one she'd spent months saving for back when we barely had enough to cover rent. She used to polish it every Sunday morning while humming old country songs. I used to tease her, saying she cared more about that table than about me. She'd laugh and tell me it wasn't just a table, it was where our life happened. Next to it sat her jewelry box, the one I built with my own hands for our 10th anniversary. I could still picture her face when I gave it to her, how she ran her fingers over the carved initials on top as if they were made of gold. And then behind those things I saw something that nearly took the air out of my lungs. Laura's hope chest. She'd kept it at the foot of our bed for 40 years, filled with mementos from our life together. Letters I wrote her when I was deployed. Photos from our honeymoon in New Mexico. The baby blanket she knitted back when we still dreamed of having kids. After she died, I moved that chest into the living room right next to my coffee chair. It was the one piece of her I couldn't let go of. Now it sat there in a stranger's truck, ready to be driven away. I swallowed hard, my throat burning. "What the hell are you doing with your mother's things?" My voice came out quieter than I expected, but sharper too. Ethan didn't answer. He just stared at the ground, his hands twitching by his sides. Vanessa finally spoke, her tone too calm, too rehearsed. "We were just storing them temporarily," she said. "To keep them safe, you know, while the house sits empty so much." Empty? The word hit me like a hammer. "I live here," I said. "This is my home." Vanessa didn't look at me. She just kept adjusting her hair, her fake calm slipping around the edges. And that's when it really sank in. This wasn't about helping. It wasn't about safety or space. This was theft, cold and calculated. They weren't moving my wife's memories for safekeeping. They were preparing to erase me from my own home. It's strange how betrayal works. It doesn't roar. It whispers. You start noticing little things, missing tiny shifts in how people speak to you, the way they look at what's yours as if it already belongs to them. And when it finally comes to light, it's not with shouting or chaos, it's with the quiet realization that you've been living beside a lie. I stood there on that truck bed, surrounded by everything Laura and I had built together, and for the first time since her funeral, I felt completely alone. Ethan finally found his voice after a long silence. His words stumbled out like nails slipping from a hammer. He said they were working on renovations for me, that they'd been clearing out rooms to start remodeling the house. The way he said it was almost casual, as if breaking into my basement with a crowbar was somehow part of home improvement. I let him talk for a few seconds. Then I took a slow breath and said, "Show me." The color drained from his face. Vanessa froze, her fake calm disappearing. She opened her mouth to say something, but I was already walking toward the house. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. Years in construction taught me that truth doesn't need to shout. It just stands there, solid as concrete. Inside, the air smelled the same as always, a mix of old wood and Laura's lavender air freshener. The light from the front windows hit the same dusty picture frames that had been there for years. No signs of work, no tools, no sawdust, no new materials stacked in corners, not even a misplaced screwdriver. We walked into the bathroom first. Same cracked tiles along the tub, same leaky faucet that I'd been meaning to fix for months. Not one thing had changed. "Where's the new vanity you said you ordered?" I asked. Ethan rubbed the back of his neck. "It's back-ordered. Supply chain issues." I nodded slowly and moved on to the kitchen. The counters were still scratched. The cabinet doors still hung crooked. The fridge hummed the same tired tune. If this was a renovation site, it was the cleanest one in history. Vanessa stepped in, forcing a bright smile. "Everything's delayed these days, Henry. You know how it is." I did know. I'd managed construction projects for 40 years. I'd seen every excuse in the book, but this one didn't even make the top 10. My jaw tightened. There was no drywall dust, no tools, no tarps, no footprints of anyone doing real work. What there was, though, was something else. A pile of receipts I'd noticed earlier sitting on the counter, the orange Home Depot logos catching my eye. I started flipping through them, pages of lumber, tile, plumbing fixtures, paint. Thousands of dollars worth of materials. All bought in the last 2 months. "All right," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Where's the $8,000 worth of supplies?" Ethan's mouth opened, but no words came out. Vanessa looked down at her shoes, her hands clasped too tightly. They both started mumbling about returns and design changes, about how they had meant to start soon, but kept waiting for something or another. The story was full of holes, like a roof after a hailstorm. That's when the anger started to rise. It wasn't the loud, explosive kind. It was the deep, slow kind, the kind that builds from your gut and crawls up your spine until your hands start to shake. Because I realized they hadn't just stolen from me. They'd rehearsed it. They'd planned the script. They'd stood in my kitchen and told lies in the same spot where Laura once made her famous peach pie for every Sunday dinner. I looked at Ethan, my only son, and said quietly, "You better start telling the truth, because I've been lied to enough for one lifetime." I stood there in my own kitchen, surrounded by silence so heavy it felt like the air itself was holding its breath. The pile of orange and white receipts sat on the counter like evidence waiting to be read aloud. I started flipping through them one by one. Home Depot, lumber, tile, plumbing fixtures, electrical wiring, paint. Thousands of dollars worth of supplies supposedly bought for this grand renovation project. Every receipt was in Ethan's name. Every purchase matched the same time frame he claimed to be fixing my home. It didn't take long for my gut to tell me what my heart didn't want to admit. Something wasn't adding up. I'd worked in construction for 40 years. I knew what a real project looked like. A remodel always left scars, dust, paint fumes, clutter, scraps of wood nails on the floor. My house looked untouched. It was too clean, too still. I spread the receipts out across the countertop like crime scene photos. $8,000, I said quietly. That's how much of my money went into this, right? Ethan shifted his weight, staring at the floor. Vanessa crossed her arms and said something about returning a few items because they changed their design plan. Her tone was too casual, too polished. I'd seen that kind of confidence before. People who lie often rehearse their lines. All right, I said, grabbing my phone. Let's make a call. Vanessa's fake smile faltered. Ethan looked up, startled, but I'd already dialed the number printed on the top of one of the receipts. It rang twice before a clerk picked up. Hi there, I said, keeping my voice steady. This is Henry Collins. I just need to verify a few transactions made under the name Ethan Collins. I read off the numbers, the dates, the store locations. The woman on the other end clicked her keyboard for what felt like an eternity. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. Yes, sir. I see those purchases here, but they were all returned the same day. Each one processed for cash refunds. I closed my eyes. It was like a punch I didn't see coming, even though some part of me had been bracing for it. All of them, I asked. Yes, sir. Every single one. Thank you, I said, and hung up. The phone felt heavier in my hand than it should have. For a moment I couldn't bring myself to look up. My own son had been running a scam on me, buying materials with my money, returning them for cash, and pocketing the difference. He didn't just steal dollars, he stole trust. I finally looked at Ethan. His face was pale and his lips trembled like he'd already confessed without saying a word. I could still remember those same hands holding a hammer beside me when he was 12, building the treehouse that used to make Laura smile every time she looked out the kitchen window. Now those same hands were the tools of a lie. You've been scamming me, I said quietly. $8,000. You turned the work I taught you into a trick to rob your own father. Ethan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. I could see guilt swimming in his eyes mixed with fear. Vanessa's face stayed blank, but her eyes darted toward the door as if she was already planning her escape. There's a kind of pain you don't feel in your body. It settles deeper somewhere between your chest and your soul. That's what betrayal feels like. It's not loud. It's quiet, steady, and cold. I set my phone down on the counter and leaned against it for support. You know, I said softly, Laura used to tell me the biggest mistake we can make as parents is thinking our kids are incapable of doing wrong. I looked at my son again. I wanted to believe she was wrong about that. For the first time since this started, Ethan met my eyes. And in that look I saw the truth plain as day. He didn't need to say a word. The damage was already done. Not long after I hung up the phone, I heard footsteps crunching across the gravel outside. When I looked out the kitchen window, I saw Mr. Grant, my next-door neighbor for nearly 15 years, heading toward the house. Grant was one of those men who never quite stopped being what he used to be. He'd retired from the Austin Police Department a decade ago, but he still walked like a cop, always scanning his surroundings, eyes sharp and steady. He'd helped me more times than I could count since Laura passed, fixing the mailbox after a storm, checking in during holidays, keeping an eye on the house when I traveled. If anyone knew when something didn't look right, it was him. He must have heard the arguing, because by the time he reached the porch, his jaw was set and his tone was all business. "Everything all right over here, Henry?" he asked, glancing toward the truck in the driveway. "Not really," I said. "You might want to take a look at this." I led him inside, where Ethan and Vanessa stood stiff as fence posts. Grant gave them one long, assessing look that could have melted steel. Then he turned his attention to the scene like he was back on duty again. He started small, checking the locks on the doors, the windows, the basement entry. Then he moved to the study where I kept all my paperwork. I watched him crouch by my filing cabinet, running his fingers lightly over the metal. "Henry," he said quietly, "you see these scratches around the keyhole?" I nodded. "Didn't notice before." "Yeah, well," he said, leaning closer, "these aren't new. See how the edges have darkened? That's oxidation. This thing's been picked a while ago, at least a few weeks. Maybe longer." My stomach turned. That cabinet held everything important: insurance papers, the deed to the house, copies of Laura's will. It wasn't just a drawer of documents. It was the blueprint of my life. Grant stood and dusted off his hands. This wasn't some spur-of-the-moment stunt. They've been in here before. More than once. He started looking deeper, his instincts kicking in. He pointed out small things I hadn't noticed. Tiny scuff marks on the hardwood where furniture had been shifted, dust patterns on shelves that didn't match the faint imprint of a box recently moved. It was all so subtle, but to a trained eye it told a clear story. "They've been coming in and out of this place for weeks," Grant said. "Maybe months. Timing it for when you're gone." I sank into Laura's old recliner, the one I'd never been able to throw out. My mind replayed the last few months, every grocery trip, every poker night at the VFW, every doctor's appointment Ethan conveniently asked about ahead of time. He hadn't been concerned about my schedule. He'd been tracking it. It hit me then, this wasn't desperation. This was organized, planned, calculated. Grant crossed his arms, watching me closely. "Henry, you didn't just catch them stealing stuff. You caught them in the middle of a system. They knew exactly what they were doing." He was right. Every visit, every excuse, every innocent question, it had all been part of the setup. I stared at the cabinet again, at those faint scratch marks, and realized I hadn't just been robbed of things. I'd been robbed of trust, of peace, of the illusion that I was safe in my own home. Grant put a hand on my shoulder, steady and firm. "Listen," he said, "whatever happens next, you're not handling this alone. I've seen people like this before. They start small, then they go for bigger things. We're going to figure out just how deep this goes." I nodded, trying to swallow the lump in my throat. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, I felt a strange mix of anger and relief. Anger at what my son had done, and relief that at least someone else finally saw the truth I'd been too blind to see. After Grant finished looking over the house, I felt like the floor had dropped out from under me. Finding out that Ethan and Vanessa had been sneaking in for weeks was bad enough, but something about the way Grant kept studying that file cabinet made me uneasy. The scratches, the missing folders, it wasn't just about stolen furniture anymore. It was something bigger, something uglier. "Henry," Grant said, his voice low but steady, "if they've been going through your files, you need to check your finances. Now." He was right. I walked straight to the phone and called my lawyer, Jim Patterson. He'd handled Laura's estate and the mortgage payoff after she died. A good man, sharp as a tack, the kind you trust, with things you don't tell your kids. When he answered, I tried to keep my tone even, but my throat was tight. "Jim, I need to ask you something important," I said. "Has anyone contacted your office pretending to represent me, asking about my property or refinancing?" There was a pause, too long, too heavy. I could hear the faint shuffling of papers on the other end. "Actually, yes," Jim said finally. "About 3 weeks ago. A man called asking what documentation would be needed to take out a home equity loan. Said he was acting on your behalf. I thought it sounded odd, but he knew details about your property address, square footage, even your insurance provider." My stomach clenched. "You didn't give him anything, did you?" "Of course not," he said. "I told him you'd need to call me directly, but it bothered me enough that I made a note of it." I thanked him and hung up. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. Grant was watching me from across the room, his expression turning darker by the second. "What did he say?" he asked. I swallowed hard. Someone tried to take a loan out on my house, claimed they were representing me. Grant let out a slow whistle. "And let me guess, you keep copies of all your property documents, insurance forms, and bank statements right here in that cabinet?" I nodded. Used to. We both walked over to the filing cabinet. I pulled open the top drawer, the one that always stuck a little on the left side, and flipped through what was left. The folder that should have held my deed copies was almost empty. The insurance papers were gone. So were the property surveys, the appraisal from last year, and the notarized statement showing the mortgage had been paid in full. Grant looked at me grimly. They took everything they'd need to forge a mortgage. He rubbed his chin, thinking. Vanessa works in real estate, doesn't she? She'd know the process, what documents are required, how to contact lenders, even how to fake a signature if she had samples. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. All those times she'd been in my study helping Ethan look through my mail, asking casual questions about my insurance or property taxes, it all clicked into place. She hadn't been helping. She'd been preparing. Grant stepped closer, his voice low and deliberate. I've seen this before. It's called a home equity scam. They take out a loan against your property, pocket the money, and disappear. By the time the bank comes knocking, you're on the hook for hundreds of thousands and they're long gone. My knees went weak and I had to grab the edge of the desk to steady myself. The house Laura and I spent 30 years building, paying off bit by bit. It wasn't just walls and a roof. It was her. Every photo on the wall, every mark on the floor, every memory we made together. The thought that Ethan and Vanessa had planned to use it for cash made me feel physically sick. How much could they have gotten? I asked quietly. Grant didn't sugarcoat it. With this property, 200 grand, maybe more. Enough to vanish and start over. The number hit me like a brick. I tried to breathe, but the air felt heavy, thick, impossible. They hadn't just been stealing my belongings, they'd been trying to steal my life. Grant put a hand on my shoulder. You caught them just in time, Henry. They were getting ready to sign your future away. But now you've got proof, and we're going to make sure they can't hurt you again. I nodded, but my mind was spinning. You raise a child thinking your love will protect them from greed, from selfishness, from the darker corners of the world. You tell yourself family means safety. But as I looked around my study, all I could think was this: sometimes the people you'd die to protect are the very ones digging your grave. That evening the house felt colder than usual. The rain had stopped, but the silence inside carried a different kind of storm. Grant stood by the front door, his arms folded, watching quietly like a sentry who'd seen too many scenes like this before. Ethan and Vanessa sat together on the couch, barely speaking, their faces pale under the yellow light of Laura's old lamp. I could see the fear starting to set in. I took my time gathering everything. The receipts, the bank statements, the missing documents list, and the pictures I'd taken of the truck and the basement lock. When I laid them all out across the coffee table, it looked like the aftermath of a crime scene. This, I said, pointing to the papers, is what you've done. $8,000 in fake renovation expenses, $15,000 in stolen property, and a plan to take out a $200,000 loan against my house. Ethan's head dropped into his hands. Vanessa just crossed her legs and leaned back, pretending to look unfazed. That's $25,000 in damages before we even get to the fraud, I continued. You've been lying to me for months, walking into my home like you own it, taking things that weren't yours to touch. Ethan's voice cracked when he finally spoke. Dad, we didn't mean for it to go this far. We were desperate. I didn't say anything. I let him keep talking, because silence has a way of pulling the truth out faster than shouting ever could. I lost the contracting business 6 months ago, he went on, his voice trembling. The bills piled up, credit cards maxed out. The landlord was threatening eviction. Vanessa said you wouldn't notice if we borrowed some of your stuff, maybe just until we got back on our feet. Vanessa snapped her head toward him, eyes wide with anger. Don't you dare put this on me, she hissed. Then she turned to me, her tone sharp as glass. You have everything, Henry. A paid-off house, retirement savings insurance, a full fridge. You live alone in a 4-bedroom home while we can barely afford rent. You wouldn't understand what that's like. Her words hit like acid, not because they were true, but because they were twisted. I'd spent my life working to build stability for my family. Every long night on a construction site every winter when I took double shifts to pay the mortgage that wasn't privilege. That was sacrifice. I leaned forward, looking her straight in the eye. You're right, Vanessa. I don't understand stealing from someone you call family. I don't understand breaking into a man's home while he's grieving his wife. And I sure as hell don't understand calling theft borrowing. She looked away, jaw tight. Family, I said, my voice low but steady, is built on honesty and respect, not entitlement, not greed. You don't get to betray someone just because they've worked harder than you. Ethan wiped his face, tears streaking down his cheeks. We'll make it right, Dad. Just tell us what to do. I took a deep breath, the kind that hurts on the way in. Here's what you're going to do, I said. You have 30 days to return every dollar and every item you took. After that, I file charges, grand theft, fraud, conspiracy, and whatever else the lawyer can come up with. Vanessa let out a bitter laugh, but it sounded hollow. 30 days. That's impossible. Then prison isn't, I replied quietly. Grant stepped forward, his presence filling the room with the kind of authority that comes from decades of enforcing the law. You should listen to him, he said calmly. This is already generous. The weight of those words hung in the air. No one spoke. Outside, thunder rolled again in the distance, low and steady, as if the sky itself was warning what would come next. Ethan nodded slowly, his voice barely above a whisper. We'll figure it out. See that you do, I said, standing up. Because this isn't about money anymore. It's about the kind of people you choose to be. As they left, the front door shut with a hollow sound that echoed through the house. I stood in the middle of the living room, surrounded by Laura's things, by the memories we'd built, by the ghosts of the family I thought I had. And for the first time I realized that sometimes the hardest part of being a father isn't protecting your children. It's teaching them what happens when they destroy the very thing that protected them all along. The days that followed were heavy, quiet, and strange. Ethan left that night without another word, and for a while I didn't know if I'd ever see him again. But less than a week later, Mr. Grant stopped by with an update. He'd seen Ethan at a construction site on the other side of town. Your boy's working, Grant said. Sun up to sundown. Looks like he's trying. Turns out Ethan had taken a job with a local contractor, ironically the same company that used to compete against his failed business. $15 an hour. Hard, dirty work that left no room for pride. I could almost see the poetic justice in it, but that wasn't all. A few days later, Grant mentioned that Ethan had picked up a second job working as a night security guard. 2 shifts back to back. Midnight to 8, then straight to the job site by 9. I didn't know whether to feel proud or sad, maybe both. Meanwhile, Vanessa disappeared. She packed what she could and left him without a word. Cleaned out their joint savings account, $3,000 gone overnight. Grant told me she'd moved in with her sister in Dallas. I wasn't surprised. People like her always ran when things got tough. Ethan was left with nothing but his debts and his guilt. I started hearing bits and pieces about him through the grapevine. He'd sold his truck, that shiny Ford F-150 he once bragged about, and replaced it with an old Honda that coughed smoke every morning. He sold his tools too, the ones I'd given him when he started his first business. Those tools had been a symbol of everything I'd taught him: hard work, precision, pride, and doing things right. Watching him give them up felt like watching him sell a piece of himself. He rented a tiny apartment near the job site. Bare walls, 1 chair, 1 bed, no TV. He stopped drinking, stopped going out. Just worked, slept, and worked again. 30 days passed slower than I thought possible. Every evening I found myself glancing at the clock, wondering if he'd show up or vanish like his wife. On the 30th day, at exactly 7 in the morning, there was a knock at the door. When I opened it, I barely recognized him. Ethan looked like he'd aged 10 years. His clothes hung loose, dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his hands, once soft from desk work, were calloused and raw. He held out a thick envelope. $15,000, he said quietly. His voice was hoarse, almost broken. It's not the full amount, but I'll keep working until every penny is paid back. I took the envelope, feeling the weight of it in my hands. It wasn't just money. It was exhaustion, regret, humility. I could smell the concrete dust and sweat that clung to it. Every dollar in that envelope was a piece of him clawing his way back toward decency. He looked at me, then not with defiance, not with shame, but with something deeper. "I know sorry doesn't fix it," he said, "but I want to make it right." After he left, I sat in the kitchen staring at the envelope for what felt like hours. My coffee went cold. My thoughts didn't. I kept hearing Grant's words from a few nights earlier when he'd stopped by to check in. We'd been sitting on the porch watching the sun dip behind the trees. I'd told him I didn't know what to do when Ethan came back, whether to forgive him or make him face the law. Grant had taken a long sip of his coffee and said something that stuck with me. "Justice repairs Henry. Revenge destroys. You've got to decide which one you want more." Now, looking at that envelope, I understood what he meant. Forgiveness isn't about pretending nothing happened. It's about deciding what kind of man you'll be after it does. That night I didn't sleep. I sat by the window watching the rain return, tapping softly against the glass. And I thought about all the times I'd forgiven Ethan before, the missed opportunities, the lies, the bad decisions. But this time felt different. This wasn't about giving him another chance. It was about giving myself permission to hope he'd finally learned something worth keeping. Maybe he hadn't earned forgiveness yet, but for the first time in a long while, he was at least working for it. A week after Ethan brought the envelope, I called Jim, my lawyer. We sat at the kitchen table surrounded by papers, the same spot where Laura used to balance the checkbook and hum to herself while I fixed things around the house. It felt strange doing legal work in that space, but it also felt right, like I was finally restoring order to something that had been broken for too long. Jim drew up a restitution agreement. It gave Ethan 2 years to repay the remaining $10,000 with interest. Every payment had to be on time. If he missed one, I'd have the right to press full criminal charges. No second chances, no more excuses. It wasn't punishment. It was structure. Consequences with room for redemption. As for Vanessa, I pressed charges. Theft, fraud, conspiracy. She'd orchestrated the plan and abandoned Ethan when it fell apart. There was no remorse in her, no hint of growth or ownership. Jim filed the paperwork the next day. I felt no satisfaction, just a quiet sense of peace. Some lessons in life need to come from the law, not from love. 6 months passed. The seasons changed. The house started to feel alive again, not because of what was in it, but because of who was rebuilding it. Every Saturday morning, like clockwork, Ethan showed up with his tool belt and that old hammer I gave him when he was 16. The same one we used to build the back deck. The same one that had collected dust for years while our relationship fell apart. Now he used it to repair what was left of both. He fixed the porch first, replacing the warped boards and sanding down the railings until they gleamed like new. Then he painted the shutters, mowed the lawn, even replaced the old screen door that had been squeaking since before Laura got sick. Each nail, each stroke of paint felt like a quiet apology, one he never had to put into words. Sometimes we'd talk while we worked, mostly about ordinary things. Baseball, the weather, what kind of pie Laura used to make for Thanksgiving. The conversations were simple, but that was the point. Trust doesn't come back in grand gestures. It comes in steady, consistent actions, one honest moment at a time. One afternoon, while tightening the last screws on the new porch steps, Ethan paused and looked at me. His hands were covered in sawdust, his forehead glistening with sweat, but his voice was steady. "You know, Dad," he said, "I think I finally get it. Love isn't about owning or taking. It's about respecting what's been built and protecting it." I didn't say anything right away. I just nodded because he was right. That night after he left, I stood by the window and looked out at the porch lights glowing against the soft Texas dusk. The house looked strong again, whole. Not because it was perfect, but because the person helping me rebuild it finally understood what it meant to take responsibility. I whispered into the quiet, "Laura, I did it. I saved our boy. And I saved this home. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means drawing the line between love and foolishness and standing firm on it. It means teaching your heart that compassion can walk hand in hand with accountability. In the end, I learned that love without boundaries isn't kindness. It's permission for pain to repeat itself. But love with truth, with limits, with courage, that's the kind that heals. And as I looked around that evening, hearing the steady hum of the old grandfather clock Laura had adored, I realized that home isn't just a place you live in. It's a space you fight for, protect, and rebuild one act of honesty at a time.